For the first few years of its existence, the U.S. Supreme Court was considered insignificant and had little power in comparison to the Congress and the President. But after John Marshall became Chief Justice in 1801, the court took its proper place as one of the three equal branches of government and became a major policy shaper for the nation. Marshall's personal belief in a powerful central government was obvious in his agenda for the court. Under his leadership, the court helped expand the nation's fledgling capitalism and helped impose a doctrine of national supremacy over the states. During his 34 years as the Chief Justice, Marshall ruled on many famous cases that established precedents still observed today. One of Marshall's most famous cases was Marbury v. Madison in 1803. In this case, Marshall ruled on the legality of the last-minute appointment of a set of judges by President John Adams in an attempt to place Federalist judges on the bench just before leaving the presidency. Marshall used this case to establish the doctrine of judicial review, which gave the courts power to determine whether acts of the government are constitutional.
An act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void. Chief Justice John Marshall, 1803.
In the case of Fletcher v. Peck in 1810, a dispute arose over the sale of a plot of land. The Marshall Court declared that the sanctity of contracts superseded the power of a state. The ruling showed that the Supreme Court had the power to invalidate state laws that conflict with the Constitution and secured the basis of capitalism in private enterprise. The bank case of McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819 is often considered Marshall's single most important interpretation of the Constitution, because it dealt with the division of power between the federal government and the states. Shortly after Congress had created the Second Bank of the United States, the state of Maryland charged the bank's Baltimore branch a hefty tax. James McCulloch, the head cashier, refused to pay the tax, so the state took him to court. In the case, Chief Justice Marshall referred to the Constitution's necessary and proper clause, sometimes referred to as the elastic clause, when he ruled that Congress could enact legislation within the spirit of the Constitution. This case gave the federal government supremacy over the states regarding interstate business.
A government entrusted with such ample powers must also be entrusted with ample means for their execution. John Marshall, 1819.
In 1824, the Gibbons v. Ogden case, also known as the Steamboat case, Marshall declared that only Congress can control interstate commerce. A steamboat business that operated between New York and New Jersey did not believe it should have to pay an operating permit in both states. Marshall's ruling ended the battle between the states over commerce and allowed the uniform growth of business regulated by the federal government. Marshall's years as Chief Justice clearly established the idea of judicial limitation on legislative powers. This was a direction that continued when Roger Taney was appointed Chief Justice upon Marshall's death in 1835. However, Taney tended to lean toward the states when questions of national supremacy arose. In Taney's most well-known decision, the case of Scott v. Sanford in 1857, he ruled that Dred Scott, a slave who claimed to be free, was legally still a slave.
We think they, people of African ancestry, are not included, and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to all citizens of the United States. Roger B. Taney, 1857.
This decision repealed the Kansas-Nebraska Act as well as the Missouri Compromise and threw the nation into a tailspin over the issue of slavery that resulted in the Civil War. After the war, Scott v. Sanford led to the necessity of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which gave freedom to former slaves and guaranteed them equal protection under the law as citizens. During the decades of the 1950s and 60s, America experienced great change and great turmoil, especially in the area of civil rights. During this time, Earl Warren served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He strongly believed the court should be the compass for shaping and molding the nation's evolving moral and civil liberties. By the end of his tenure as Chief Justice, Warren had been at the center of many rulings that did exactly that. Warren's very first case is one of the landmark cases of U.S. history and was indicative of how he would conduct the court. In Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, a young black girl named Linda Brown and her family alleged that the school board in Topeka, Kansas, was depriving her of the equal protection required by the 14th Amendment by segregating its schools. The lead attorney appointed to prosecute the case, Thurgood Marshall, relentlessly attacked Plessy v. Ferguson, an 1896 case that set the precedent for legal segregation by establishing the doctrine of separate but equal. The Warren Court unanimously decided to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson.
We conclude that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1954.
Another landmark case during Warren's tenure was Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963. In this case, the Warren Court declared that all persons accused of any crime should be provided a lawyer by the state if they could not afford one themselves, guaranteeing no one would go to jail without legal counsel. The same year, the Warren Court also ended required Bible reading in public schools with its decision in the Engel v. Vitale case. A group of parents in New York claimed the requirement for students to recite a prayer at the beginning of each school day infringed on their First Amendment rights, and the court agreed. Another well-known case in 1963 involved Ernesto Miranda, who signed a confession for kidnapping and assault without fully understanding his rights. After he was convicted, he appealed the decision, claiming his confession was obtained illegally. In Miranda v. Arizona, the Supreme Court agreed and declared that all persons must have their rights read to them at the time of their arrest to ensure they understand their civil liberty rights. The Miranda rights are now embedded in routine police practices. Another Chief Justice that did not shy away from difficult decisions was Warren Burger. Serving as the nation's judicial leader from 1969 to 1986, Burger and his Supreme Court were at the center of two highly controversial and headline-grabbing cases in the 1970s that had a huge impact on the nation. Even though the Burger Court was not known for favoring activism, its decisions on these two cases were definitely influenced by the activist era of the 70s. In 1973, Burger and his court were confronted with an extremely controversial case concerning abortion, Roe v. Wade. With its decision, the court made abortions legal, based on the 14th Amendment's due process right to privacy clause. Roe v. Wade was not a unanimous decision, which was an indication of the controversial nature of the case, and the debates, both the topic and the case, would continue to ignite. The advantage Roe v. Wade originally gave to abortion rights supporters has eroded over time. Several decisions since Roe v. Wade have upheld state laws that restricted abortion rights, limited abortion access for poor women, and excluded abortion from the health care services provided by the federal government through Medicaid. Another landmark case heard by the Burger Court addressed the issue of affirmative action programs, which had been established to provide minorities and women with job and educational equality. When Alan Bakke, a 35-year-old white man, applied to the University of California Medical School and was denied admission, he claimed it was because he did not help fulfill a minority admissions quota. In Regents of University of California v. Bakke, Bakke argued that he was a victim of reverse discrimination, and that it should not be tolerated just to make up for years of bias against women and minorities. The court issued a decision that although affirmative action programs are legal, race and gender cannot be the only factors taken into account.
The guarantees of the 14th Amendment extend to all persons. Its language is explicit. The guarantee of equal protection cannot mean one thing when applied to one individual and something else when applied to a person of another color. Justice Lewis F. Powell, 1978.
Since there was no single majority opinion in the case, and because the court ruled that the use of race as a criterion in admissions decisions in higher education was constitutionally permissible, a national debate over affirmative action ensued. Two parallel cases in 2001 challenged the reverse discrimination policies of higher education institutions. Again, the Supreme Court stopped short of a definitive answer concerning affirmative action.